In 1893, a man named William Carwardine watched a family collect their paycheck at the Pullman payment window. The father had worked a full week, 72 hours. He stood at the window with his wife beside him and his 2 children waiting near the door. The cashier counted the deductions: rent, gas, water, a doctor's bill from 2 months prior, then slid a single coin across the counter. 2 cents. The man looked at it, did not speak, picked it up, walked his family home through the snow. Carwardine, a minister who later wrote a book about everything he witnessed inside Pullman, said what he remembered most was not the coin. It was the silence. The man did not argue, did not shout, because he already understood something it took Carwardine months to grasp. There was nothing to argue with. The math was correct. The deductions were legal. The contract had been signed. A man had worked 72 hours in America, and the system had processed him perfectly and returned 2 cents and called the account settled. That was not a mistake. That was the point. George Pullman was the wealthiest man in Illinois in 1880. He built sleeping cars for railroads, and he had decided that where his workers lived was inefficient. So he bought 4,000 acres south of Chicago and built an entire city from the ground up. Streets, sewers, a church, a library, a theater, a school, a market, 1,800 units of housing. All of it finished by 1881. All of it owned entirely by the Pullman Palace Car Company. The press called it a utopia. The King of Belgium sent a delegation. It won the gold medal at the 1893 International Hygiene Exposition for the most perfect city in the world. Here is what the journalists did not put on the front page. You could not buy your house. You could not own anything inside that city. Every brick, every door, every window, the church, the library, the school, the market, the doctor, the guards patrolling the streets, all of it belonged to George Pullman. You rented from him, bought food from his store at prices he set, saw his doctor at rates he approved. Your rent was deducted directly from your paycheck before you ever saw it. Utilities deducted, doctor's fees deducted. What remained was what the company had decided you deserved to keep. One worker told a journalist quietly, looking over his shoulder before speaking, "We are born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shop, taught in the Pullman school, catechized in the Pullman church, and when we die, we shall go to the Pullman hell." The journalist published that. The government read it and did nothing. Because here is the thing that no politician wanted to say out loud. The company town was not a failure of the American system. It was the American system working exactly as designed. The law protected property. George Pullman had property. The law protected contracts. The workers had signed contracts. Everything was in order, and Pullman was not alone. By 1900, an estimated 2,500 cities exactly like it operated across the United States. Coal towns in West Virginia, steel towns in Pennsylvania, textile towns in the Carolinas, copper towns in Arizona. Between 20 and 30 million Americans spent significant portions of their working lives inside a company town. 1 in every 4 American industrial workers lived in a city owned by his employer. 1 in 4. In the spring of 1894, George Pullman made a decision he believed was perfectly reasonable. The country was in a severe economic depression. Orders for railroad cars had collapsed, so he cut wages, an average of 28%. Some workers saw 40%. A skilled carpenter making $12 a week was now making $7.20. George Pullman did not cut the rent, not by a single cent. When a worker delegation asked why, the company manager explained patiently that the residential division and the manufacturing division were 2 separate business operations. The factory was struggling. The real estate was profitable. There was no reason to reduce profits in one division because another was having difficulties. The workers sat with that explanation. They were being told to their faces by a man in a clean suit that the company understood perfectly it was squeezing them from both sides simultaneously. As an employer paying them less, as a landlord charging them the same. And the man was presenting this as simple, reasonable accounting. 3 men who attended that meeting were fired the following morning for unrelated reasons. I want you to sit with one specific number, not a general statistic. One number from one man. His name was Thomas Heathcote, furniture finisher, 9 years at the factory. Wife, named Clara. 3 children ages 4, 7, and 11. After the wage cuts, he earned $8.60 a week. Rent was $4. Gas and water took another $1.12. What remained was $3.48 to feed 5 people for 7 days. He did that math 3 times on a Sunday evening, because he did not believe the first 2 answers, 69 cents per person per week, less than 10 cents per person per day. He showed Clara the paper. She looked at it without speaking, then asked what they were going to do. What Thomas did not tell her was what he had calculated next. Even if he quit tomorrow, even if he found work in Chicago the same week, which was nearly impossible during a nationwide depression, he could not leave, because he owed the company back rent from 2 months the previous winter when he had been sick. That debt had to be settled before he could collect his final paycheck. Without that paycheck, he could not pay first month's rent elsewhere. He was not in Pullman because he wanted to be. He was in Pullman because the arithmetic would not release him. This was not an accident. The debt structure inside company towns was engineered the way a trap is engineered, with complete understanding of what it was built to hold. In the coal towns of West Virginia, miners were not paid in dollars. They were paid in scrip, printed tokens issued by the company, redeemable only at the company store. You could not deposit scrip in a bank. You could not buy a train ticket with it. It was currency with walls around it, and the walls were the exact dimensions of the company's property. A miner named Samuel Day in Mingo County earned scrip worth $9 a week in 1902. After rent, food, and equipment fees, he had roughly $1.30 remaining each month. When he tried to convert it to cash, the company exchange offered 70 cents on the dollar. When he asked why, the clerk said that cash handling involved administrative costs. Samuel Day's son testified about this before a congressional committee in 1921. The congressman asked whether his father had ever considered simply leaving. The son looked at the congressman for a long moment. He said, "With what?" The congressional record shows no follow-up question. By May of 1894, at least 11 Pullman workers received paychecks that after deductions contained nothing, not reduced wages. A check for $0. The work had been performed, the hours logged. The full amount had traveled from the company's left hand to its right hand without ever touching the worker who had earned it. A reporter asked George Pullman directly whether it was true that some workers had received $0 paychecks. Pullman confirmed it was true, then explained that the company had kept those workers employed during a difficult period when the more efficient decision would have been to lay them off entirely. The company, he said, had essentially been donating labor to struggling families. The workers who had received nothing were being described as the recipients of charity. 3 days after that interview was published, 4,000 workers in Pullman, Illinois walked off the job. We are starving. Not struggling, not suffering. Starving. The woman who said that was 23 years old. Her name was Jenny Curtis. She sewed cushions in the Pullman factory for $2.25 a week. After rent deductions, she regularly received nothing. She had been supporting her sick father on a salary the company had already taken back before she could spend it. When her father died inside a Pullman house on a Pullman street, the company presented her with his outstanding rent balance as a personal debt. She now owed George Pullman money for the death of her father. Jenny Curtis stood in front of 4,000 workers on the morning of May 11, 1894, and said, "We are starving and we have nothing left to lose." The vote to strike was nearly unanimous. George Pullman's response was recorded by his board of directors. He said, "We will let the men ripen." He was describing starvation as a negotiating tactic. He was talking about 4,000 families, including Jenny Curtis, including children, and he used the word ripen as though hunger were a crop rotation he could manage from his office. What he did not account for was Eugene Debs. Debs had spent years building the American Railway Union, not a union for one craft or one company, a union for every single worker who touched a railroad regardless of what they did or where they worked. By the spring of 1894, 150,000 members across the country. Debs traveled to Pullman himself, walked the streets, sat in workers' homes, and looked at the pay stubs and the $0 paychecks. He later wrote that what he saw was not a labor dispute. It was a population mathematically reduced to servitude inside the borders of the United States of America. He called a vote. The terms were simple. If George Pullman refused independent arbitration, every member of the American Railway Union would refuse to handle any train carrying a Pullman car. George Pullman refused. He said there was nothing to arbitrate. On June 26, 1894, 125,000 railroad workers in 27 states stopped working simultaneously. Within 4 days, the number reached 250,000. Rail traffic across the entire western United States stopped. The railroads were losing approximately $1 million a day. For the first time in his life, George Pullman was losing. Then his allies went to Washington. The man they went to see was Richard Olney, the United States Attorney General, the nation's chief law enforcement officer. Richard Olney had spent his entire career as a railroad lawyer. He still held railroad stock while serving as Attorney General. He still collected a retainer from at least one railroad company while holding the highest law enforcement position in the country. This was not a secret. It was simply not considered a problem. Olney told the railroads exactly what to do. Attach United States mail cars to every Pullman train, not because the mail needed to move on those routes, because the moment a worker refused to handle a train carrying United States mail, that worker was no longer participating in a labor strike. That worker was obstructing federal mail delivery, which was a federal crime, which gave the government legal authority to intervene with the full force of federal law. In 3 days, the nation's top law enforcement officer, a man on the payroll of the railroad industry, had constructed a mechanism that converted 250,000 workers exercising their right to withhold labor into 250,000 federal criminals. Without passing a single new law, without a single vote in Congress, President Cleveland signed the federal injunction on July 2, 1894. On July 4th, Independence Day, 12,000 federal troops arrived in Chicago, not state militia, not local police, the United States Army. Deployed over the explicit written objection of the governor of Illinois, who told Cleveland the situation was under control and the troops would inflame rather than resolve the conflict. Cleveland deployed them anyway. In the 4 days that followed, 13 workers were killed, 53 wounded, more than 700 arrested. The soldier who shot a striker named James Barry near the Chicago rail yards on July 7th was never identified. The military inquiry concluded all use of force had been appropriate. Eugene Debs was arrested on July 10th, charged not with organizing the strike but with continuing to speak after a federal court ordered him to be silent. America had made it a crime for a union leader to talk. The strike collapsed within days. 250,000 workers who had stopped the railroads of an entire continent drifted back individually, without terms, without concessions, with arrest records and their names on a blacklist circulated among 24 railroad companies. Any name on that list could not be hired by any member railroad anywhere in the country. No court had ordered it, no judge had reviewed it, just a piece of paper ensuring a man could never work in his profession again, with no appeal and no hearing. Jenny Curtis was not rehired. The woman whose words had triggered the largest labor action in American history disappeared from the historical record almost immediately after the strike ended. No documentation of where she went, no record of what became of her. The men who destroyed her livelihood are in the history books. She is not. The concrete under George Pullman's grave is 6 feet thick. Not for any architectural or religious reason. The cemetery records are explicit. The Pullman family requested the reinforced concrete encasement because they were afraid that the workers George Pullman had let ripen, handed $0 paychecks and called it charity, evicted from company houses after a failed strike, would dig him up. They buried him under a fortress because the people who had known him best believed that if they left him in ordinary ground, the people he had wronged would not leave him there. While Pullman was being entombed, Congress responded to the largest labor uprising in American history. They passed one law. They made Labor Day a federal holiday. Grover Cleveland signed it 6 days after Debs was arrested. 6 days. Before the wounded had left the hospital. Before the families of the 13 dead had buried them. The fastest piece of legislation Cleveland signed in his entire presidency. A day off in September. That was the complete response of the United States government to what had just happened. The Supreme Court ruled in 1895. All 9 justices agreed unanimously that the injunction used against Debs had been constitutional. It did not examine whether $0 paychecks were compatible with a democratic republic. It did not address the Attorney General operating on the railroad payroll. It answered one question only. Did the government have the right to make union leadership a criminal act without charging anyone with a crime, without presenting evidence, without a jury? The answer was yes. President Cleveland had also commissioned an independent investigation. That separate report found that Pullman had refused reasonable arbitration, that wage cuts had not been matched by rent reductions, that workers had legitimate grievances systematically ignored, that the deployment of federal troops had been premature and inflammatory. Cleveland received that report, acknowledged it, and did nothing. The Pullman Company submitted its own version of events to the congressional record. It described a harmonious workforce briefly disturbed by outside radical agitators, now restored to productive cooperation. No mention of the 2-cent paycheck. No mention of Jenny Curtis's debt for her father's death. No mention of Thomas Heathcote's arithmetic. 2 versions of the same events, one written by the company, one written by investigators appointed by the president himself. Congress entered both into the record and acted on neither. Eugene Debs was released from jail in November 1894. He ran for president 5 times as a socialist. The 5th time, in 1920, he ran from a prison cell, arrested for speaking against the First World War. He received nearly 1 million votes while incarcerated. When he was finally released on Christmas Day, 1921, 2,000 prisoners pressed against their cell windows and cheered until they were hoarse. In 2015, President Barack Obama designated Pullman a national monument. There is a visitor center. There are guided tours. The official brochure describes Pullman as a visionary experiment in planned community development and worker welfare. The 2-cent paycheck is not mentioned. The name Jenny Curtis does not appear. The concrete under George Pullman's grave is still 6 feet thick. In 1926, Henry Ford built a town in the Amazon rainforest. He called it Fordlandia, Cape Cod-style houses in the middle of the jungle. He banned alcohol. He banned tobacco. He set mandatory meal times. He owned every building, every store, every rule. It was Pullman in Brazil, 40 years later. The workers rioted in 1930. Ford sent in the Brazilian army. The town collapsed in 1945. The ruins are still there. Nobody in America learns about Fordlandia in school. In 2021, Amazon workers at a fulfillment center in Bessemer, Alabama, voted on whether to form a union. Amazon spent $4.3 million on anti-union consultants. They placed television screens inside bathroom stalls, broadcasting anti-union messages so workers could not use the toilet without receiving corporate communication. The union lost. That same year, Amazon's productivity algorithm was generating automatic termination notices faster than human managers could review them. One worker in a Kentucky facility had a heart attack on the warehouse floor. The algorithm registered his collapse as a time-off task violation before the ambulance arrived. A man's heart stopped. The first thing the system recorded was that he had stopped being productive. George Pullman would have recognized that logic immediately. He had used the same logic in 1894 when he explained that workers receiving $0 paychecks were the recipients of his generosity. The language is different. The software is more sophisticated. The system processes the human being and returns what it calculates is owed. And what it calculates is owed is always, structurally, mathematically, by design, less than what was taken. Here is the last thing I want to tell you. Thomas Heathcote sat at his kitchen table in 1893 and did arithmetic that proved his family could not survive on what the company paid him. He showed Clara the numbers. She looked at them for a long time and asked what they were going to do. In 2021, a warehouse worker in Bessemer named Michael Barber sat at his kitchen table and did the same arithmetic. $15.50 an hour. After taxes, after mandatory insurance deductions, after transportation costs to a facility with no public transit access, approximately $19,000 a year. Median rent for a two-bedroom apartment within commuting distance, $16,800 annually. Remaining for food, clothing, utilities, and everything else a human life requires. $2,200 for the entire year. Michael Barber was one of the workers who tried to organize that union. After it lost, he kept working. He had a daughter, he had rent, he had the same reason Thomas Heathcote had for going back on Monday morning. There was nothing else to do. George Pullman put flower boxes on every window in his perfect city, so the journalists would write about the flowers instead of the arithmetic. The flowers are different now. The arithmetic is the same. We found the names of the men who built this system. We found the names of the men who broke it. Jenny Curtis we could not find. If anyone watching this has found her, tell us in the comments. She deserves to be in the record.